With a mark like that, you'll never find anyone, she would hiss. I was ashamed of myself. But it turned out this mark was an exact copy of what my grandfather had, the one nobody ever talked about. Growing up in my grandmother's house felt like living under a microscope that only saw flaws. Every morning when I'd shuffle to the bathroom, half asleep and vulnerable, she'd be there waiting with her morning dose of poison. The birthmark stretched across the left side of my face, a wine-colored stain that started near my temple and swept down toward my jawline like spilled paint. It wasn't huge, but it was noticeable enough that strangers would do that thing where they try not to stare, but end up staring anyway. She never missed an opportunity to remind me of my place in the world. When I'd reach for seconds at dinner, she'd click her tongue and mutter about how boys shouldn't draw attention to themselves when they already had enough working against them. When school pictures came around, she'd conveniently forget to order them, claiming it was a waste of money. The few family photos that existed from my childhood either had me turned away or were cropped so tight that half my face disappeared. The worst part wasn't even the daily comments. It was the way she'd physically recoil sometimes, like my face was something that hurt her to look at. I'd catch her staring with this expression of pure disgust, and then she'd quickly look away and busy herself with something else. I started avoiding mirrors, avoiding cameras, avoiding anything that might reflect back what she saw when she looked at me. School became my refuge, but even there the mark followed me. Kids would whisper and point, though most of them were too young to be truly cruel about it. Teachers would sometimes do a double take when they first met me, and I learned to introduce myself while looking slightly away so they could process it without feeling awkward. I threw myself into books, into homework, into anything that would make people notice my brain instead of my face. By middle school, the comments from my grandmother had evolved into longer lectures about realistic expectations. She'd sit me down at the kitchen table with her coffee and tell me about how I needed to focus on developing my personality, my skills, my usefulness to others. She'd explain that some people were blessed with looks and others had to make up for it in different ways. The subtext was always clear. I was firmly in the second category, and I better start working twice as hard to compensate. The isolation was crushing. While other kids my age were figuring out crushes and awkward flirting, I was convinced that no one would ever see past the mark. My grandmother's voice had become the narrator in my head, constantly reminding me that I was damaged goods. I'd watch movies and see the romantic leads and feel this hollow ache, knowing that kind of story wasn't meant for someone like me. High school brought new challenges. Suddenly, everyone was more appearance conscious, more aware of social hierarchies. I learned to sit in the back corner of classrooms, to walk with my head down in hallways, to make myself as invisible as possible. The few times someone showed interest in being my friend, I'd sabotage it somehow, convinced they were just being polite or that they'd eventually realize what my grandmother had been telling me all along. She never let up, even as I got older. If anything, she seemed to double down as I approached adulthood. She'd make comments about how I should be grateful for any attention I got, how I shouldn't be picky, how I needed to understand that my standards should match my circumstances. When I graduated high school, instead of celebrating, she used it as an opportunity to lecture me about how college was my chance to reinvent myself, to focus on what really mattered since I'd never have looks to fall back on. The summer before college was particularly brutal. I was working part-time at a local store, trying to save money, and every evening I'd come home to find her waiting with some new observation about how I'd interacted with customers or how I'd presented myself. She'd critique everything from my posture to my voice to the way I made eye contact, always circling back to how I needed to be extra careful about first impressions because I didn't have the luxury of recovering from them. I started college with all this baggage weighing me down. My dorm roommate was a decent guy, but I could see him processing my face when we first met, and I immediately went into defensive mode. I told him about my birthmark like it was a medical condition that needed explaining, trying to get ahead of any awkwardness. He was cool about it, but I still felt like I had to prove my worth through other means. The freedom of college was intoxicating, but it also left me adrift. Without my grandmother's daily reminders of my limitations, I wasn't sure how to interact with the world. I'd been so conditioned to see myself through her eyes that I didn't know who I was when she wasn't there to define me. I threw myself into my studies, into campus activities, into anything that would give me identity beyond the mark on my face. But even thousands of miles away, her voice followed me. When I catch someone looking at my birthmark, I'd hear her explaining why they were looking. When I'd feel attracted to someone, I'd hear her reminding me of my place. When I'd accomplish something academically or socially, I'd hear her attributing it to compensation rather than genuine merit. Update 1. Everything changed during winter break of my sophomore year. I was home for the holidays, and my mom was going through old boxes in the basement, trying to organize family photos for a scrapbook project. She'd been doing this off and on for months, but this time she called me down to help sort through some of the older pictures. Most of the photos were the usual suspects: family gatherings, holidays, school events. But then she pulled out a box I'd never seen before, filled with older pictures that looked like they were from before I was born. The photos were yellowed and slightly faded, showing people I didn't recognize in clothes that looked like they were from the 80s and 90s. I was flipping through them casually when one made me stop cold. It was a picture of a man I didn't recognize, probably in his 30s, standing next to a car and smiling at the camera. But what made me freeze wasn't his face. It was the birthmark. The exact same birthmark that I saw in the mirror every day, in the exact same place, with the exact same shape and color. My hands were actually shaking as I held the photo. I stared at it for what felt like minutes, trying to process what I was seeing. The resemblance was so precise that it looked like someone had photoshopped my birthmark onto this stranger's face. Even the way it curved near the temple, even the way it faded at the edges, everything was identical. I called my mom over, trying to keep my voice steady, and asked who the man in the photo was. She looked at the picture and got this strange expression on her face, like she was seeing something she'd forgotten about. After a long pause, she said it was my grandfather, her father-in-law, my dad's dad. The world tilted. I'd never seen a photo of my grandfather before. Whenever I'd asked about him over the years, the adults would get uncomfortable and change the subject. My dad would mumble something about him not being around anymore, and my grandmother would get this tight-lipped look that discouraged further questions. I'd assumed he'd died when I was too young to remember him. But here he was, looking back at me with my own birthmark, and suddenly nothing made sense anymore. If this was my grandfather, why had no one ever mentioned that we shared this distinctive mark? Why had my grandmother spent years making me feel like a freak when she'd been married to someone who looked exactly like me? I pressed my mom for more information, but she seemed reluctant to talk about it. She kept saying it was complicated, that it was family business, that maybe I should ask my dad when he got home from work. But I could see in her eyes that there was more to the story, something that had been deliberately kept from me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the years of shame, all the times my grandmother had made me feel like my face was some kind of cosmic mistake. The photo was still in my room, and I found myself staring at it in the dark, trying to understand what it meant for everything I'd believed about myself. When my dad got home the next day, I confronted him with the photo. His reaction was even more telling than my mom's had been. He actually went pale when he saw it, and I watched him struggle with how much to tell me. Finally, after a lot of hemming and hawing, he admitted that yes, this was his father, and yes, the birthmark was hereditary. But when I asked why no one had ever mentioned this before, why I'd grown up thinking I was some kind of anomaly, he got quiet. He kept saying it was complicated, that there were family issues, that some things were better left in the past. The more he avoided my questions, the more determined I became to get answers. I decided to confront my grandmother directly. I waited until we were alone in the kitchen the next morning, and I put the photo on the table between us. I asked her straight out why she'd never told me that my grandfather had the same birthmark, why she'd let me grow up thinking I was deformed when I was actually carrying a family trait. The reaction was immediate and intense. She went white as a sheet, and for a moment I thought she might actually faint. Then her face flushed red, and she grabbed the photo like it was on fire. She started saying things like how I had no right to go through old pictures, how some things should stay buried, how I was stirring up trouble that had been settled long ago. But I wasn't backing down anymore. I'd spent too many years accepting her version of reality, and seeing that photo had cracked something open in me. I kept pressing, kept asking questions, kept demanding to know why she'd made me hate something that connected me to my family history. Finally, she broke. She sat down heavily in her chair and stared at the photo with this expression of pure hatred. Then she started talking, and what she told me changed everything I thought I knew about my family and about myself. Update 2. The story that came pouring out of my grandmother that morning was like something from a soap opera, except it was my life, my family, my face that had been caught in the middle of it all. She told me about how my grandfather had left her when I was just a baby, how he'd walked out on his family to be with another woman, how he'd abandoned his responsibilities and broken apart everything she'd built. But the part that hit me like a physical blow was when she admitted that every time she looked at me, she saw him. She said the birthmark was like having his face staring back at her every day, reminding her of the betrayal, the abandonment, the humiliation of being left behind. She'd spent years trying to forget him, trying to rebuild her life, and then I'd come along looking exactly like the man who'd destroyed her world. She told me about how she'd tried to love me despite the resemblance, but it was too hard. Every milestone, every achievement, every moment of pride was contaminated by the memory of him. When I'd smile, she'd see his smile. When I'd laugh, she'd hear his laugh. The birthmark was just the most obvious reminder, but apparently everything about me echoed the man she'd learned to hate. The worst part was realizing that all those years of criticism and shame hadn't been about me at all. I'd been living my entire life as a scapegoat for someone else's betrayal, carrying the weight of a relationship that had imploded before I was old enough to understand what was happening. My grandmother hadn't been trying to protect me or prepare me for the world. She'd been punishing me for existing with his face. She kept talking, and the details got worse. She told me about how my grandfather had been charming and handsome, how women had always been drawn to him, how she'd always worried about other women but had trusted him anyway. When he'd left, it hadn't been a gradual breakdown or a mutual decision. He'd simply announced one day that he'd found someone else, someone younger, someone who made him happier. The betrayal had been complete and devastating. He'd taken their savings, left her with debts she didn't know about, and moved across the country with his new girlfriend. She'd had to rebuild her entire life from scratch, working multiple jobs to keep the house, dealing with the whispers and pity from neighbors who'd watched her perfect marriage crumble. But here's the part that really broke me. She admitted that she'd forbidden anyone from talking about him, from showing me pictures, from mentioning the resemblance. She'd made my parents promise to keep his existence a secret because she couldn't bear the thought of me knowing about him, of maybe being proud of looking like him. She'd wanted to erase him completely, and I'd been collateral damage in that erasure. As she talked, I started to understand the full scope of what had been done to me. Every cruel comment, every moment of shame, every time she'd made me feel like I was fundamentally flawed, it had all been displacement. She'd been so consumed by her hatred for him that she'd transferred it to me, and I'd spent my entire life thinking I deserved it. The revelation was overwhelming. Part of me felt relief, finally understanding that the problem hadn't been with me, that I wasn't actually the monster she'd made me believe I was. But another part of me felt this deep, burning anger at the injustice of it all. I'd lost years of my life to shame that wasn't mine to carry, years of isolation and self-hatred that had been built on a lie. I wanted to know more about my grandfather, to understand who he really was beyond her version of him. But every question I asked seemed to make her more agitated. She kept insisting that he was a terrible man, that he'd destroyed everything he touched, that I should be grateful she'd tried to prevent me from becoming like him. But I was starting to question everything she'd ever told me. If she'd been capable of lying about something this fundamental for my entire life, what else had been distorted by her pain? Had my grandfather really been the villain she portrayed, or was I only getting one side of a complicated story? The conversation ended with her storming out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with the photo and a head full of questions. I felt like I'd been living in a funhouse mirror my whole life, where everything was warped and distorted, and I was just now seeing the real shapes behind the reflections. That night I called my dad and demanded the whole truth. I told him I was done with family secrets, done with being protected from information about my own life. I wanted to know everything about my grandfather, not just my grandmother's version, but the real story. What he told me was more nuanced than I'd expected. Yes, my grandfather had left, and yes, it had been devastating for my grandmother. But the situation had been more complicated than she'd made it seem. My grandfather had been struggling with depression, had felt trapped in a marriage that had become more about obligation than love, had been dealing with financial problems that he'd hidden from everyone. The other woman hadn't been some homewrecker who'd stolen him away. She'd been a colleague who'd become a friend during a difficult time, and their relationship had developed slowly over months of my grandfather feeling increasingly isolated in his marriage. The decision to leave hadn't been impulsive or cruel. It had been the result of years of growing unhappiness that no one had acknowledged or addressed. But here's what really got to me. My dad told me that my grandfather had tried to maintain a relationship with our family after he left. He'd wanted to be part of my life, had asked to see me, had sent letters and cards that my grandmother had intercepted. She'd cut off all contact, had moved to make sure he couldn't find us, had effectively erased him from our lives out of her own pain and anger. I was starting to realize that I'd been robbed of more than just self-acceptance. I'd been robbed of a relationship with someone who might have understood what it was like to live with this face, who might have helped me see the birthmark as something other than a burden. Instead, I'd grown up thinking I was alone in the world, carrying a mark that made me unlovable. Update 3. The weeks after that conversation were some of the strangest of my life. I felt like I was rebuilding my entire identity from scratch, questioning everything I believed about myself and my place in the world. The photo of my grandfather became like a talisman. I'd stare at it and try to imagine what it would have been like to grow up knowing that someone else had shared this experience. I became obsessed with learning more about him. I started researching online, looking through public records, trying to piece together what his life had been like after he'd left. It took weeks of searching, but eventually I found traces of him. An obituary from about 5 years earlier, some mentions in local newspapers, a few social media profiles of people who might have known him. The obituary was brief, but revealing. It mentioned that he'd worked in education, that he'd been involved in community theater, that he'd been survived by a second wife and several stepchildren who clearly loved him. There were photos from his memorial service, and in every single one, he wore his birthmark like it was just another feature of his face. No shame, no hiding, no apology for existing. I found myself staring at those photos for hours, trying to understand how someone with my exact face could look so comfortable in his own skin. In my grandmother's house, the birthmark had been treated like a deformity, something to be hidden and ashamed of. But in these pictures, my grandfather looked confident, happy, completely at ease with himself. I started reaching out to people who might have known him. It was awkward and complicated, explaining who I was and why I was asking, but some of them were willing to talk. What I learned painted a picture of a man who was nothing like the monster my grandmother had described. His colleagues remembered him as a dedicated teacher who went out of his way to help students who felt like outsiders. His neighbors described him as quiet but kind, always willing to lend a hand or offer advice. His stepchildren, now adults, talked about how he'd embraced them as his own, how he'd never made them feel like they were less important than his biological family. But the conversation that really changed everything was with his second wife. I found her contact information through one of the obituary mentions, and after several nervous phone calls, she agreed to talk with me. What she told me about my grandfather's later life was both heartbreaking and inspiring. She said that when they'd first met, he'd been carrying enormous guilt about leaving his first family. He'd tried repeatedly to maintain contact with his son, my father, and had been devastated when those attempts were blocked. He'd talked often about his desire to meet his grandchildren, particularly me, and had wondered constantly whether I'd inherited the family birthmark. She told me that he'd struggled with self-acceptance himself, that the birthmark had been a source of insecurity in his younger years. He'd learned to embrace it as he got older, had even joked about it being his signature feature, but he'd always worried about passing that burden on to future generations. He'd hoped that if any of his descendants inherited it, they'd find it easier to love themselves than he had. The irony was crushing. While I'd been growing up hating the mark, convinced it made me unlovable, he'd been hundreds of miles away hoping I'd learn to see it as something that made me unique. While my grandmother had been teaching me to hide from the world, he'd been learning to live openly and authentically. His widow sent me more photos, family gatherings where my grandfather was laughing and relaxed, vacation pictures where he was clearly enjoying himself, professional photos where the birthmark was visible but seemed irrelevant to his confidence. In every image, he looked like someone who'd made peace with himself, who'd learned that his worth wasn't determined by his appearance. She also sent me letters he'd written but never sent, dozens of them, addressed to me throughout my childhood and adolescence. Birthday cards, holiday greetings, letters of advice and encouragement, all written in the hope that someday he'd have the chance to deliver them. Reading them was like getting a glimpse of the relationship we could have had, the support and understanding I'd missed out on. In one letter, written when I would have been about 10, He'd written about the challenges of living with a distinctive birthmark, about the importance of not letting other people's reactions define your self-worth. In another, from when I would have been in high school, he'd written about finding the courage to be yourself in a world that often demands conformity. The most powerful letter was the last one, written just a few months before he died. In it, he'd expressed regret about not being able to be part of my life, hope that I was growing up confident and loved, and a wish that if I'd inherited the family mark, I was wearing it with pride. He'd written about how the birthmark had become, for him, a symbol of resilience rather than shame. Reading those letters, I realized that I'd been carrying not just his physical mark, but also his capacity for growth and self-acceptance. The difference was that he'd had the chance to learn these lessons through experience, while I'd been trapped in someone else's narrative of what the mark meant. I started to see my face differently. Instead of a burden passed down through genetics, the birthmark became a connection to someone who'd struggled with similar challenges and had found a way through them. Instead of something that made me unlovable, it became evidence that I came from people who'd learned to love themselves despite the world's judgments. The anger I felt toward my grandmother began to shift into something more complex. I still resented the years of unnecessary shame, but I was starting to understand that her cruelty had come from her own pain. She'd been so wounded by abandonment that she'd projected that wound onto me, seeing in my face not a grandchild to love, but a reminder of her deepest hurt. Final update. The confrontation with my grandmother happened during spring break of my junior year. I'd been carrying all this new knowledge for months, trying to figure out how to address the years of damage that had been done. Part of me wanted to just cut contact and move on with my life, but another part knew that I needed to have one final conversation to get closure. I sat her down in the same kitchen where she'd spent years chipping away at my self-worth, and I told her everything I'd learned. I showed her the photos I'd collected, shared the stories people had told me about my grandfather, read excerpts from the letters he'd written to me. I watched her face as I described the man he'd actually been, not the villain she'd created in her mind. Her reaction was everything I'd expected and nothing I prepared for. She went through denial, anger, bargaining, and grief all in the space of an hour. She insisted that I was being manipulated by people who hadn't known the real him, that I was choosing to believe lies over the truth she'd tried to protect me from. But as I kept talking, kept showing evidence of who my grandfather had been after he'd left, I could see her certainty beginning to crack. The breakthrough came when I read her one of his letters, the one where he'd written about hoping his grandson would find self-acceptance easier than he had. As I read his words about wanting to spare future generations the pain of shame, I watched her face change. For the first time, I think she began to understand that her attempt to erase him had ended up recreating his struggle in me. She broke down completely. The crying was ugly and raw, decades of suppressed grief and anger finally finding an outlet. She talked about how devastated she'd been when he left, how she'd felt like her entire identity had been built around being his wife, how his abandonment had shattered her sense of self-worth. She'd convinced herself that if she could just forget him completely, the pain would go away. But seeing me every day had made forgetting impossible. Every time she'd looked at my face, she'd been forced to remember not just his betrayal, but also the good times, the man she'd fallen in love with, the life they'd shared before it all fell apart. The birthmark had become a trigger for all of that complicated grief, and she dealt with it by trying to make me ashamed of carrying it. What surprised me was that she actually apologized, not just for the cruel comments or the shame she'd imposed, but for stealing my chance to know my grandfather, for depriving me of a relationship that might have saved me years of self-hatred. She admitted that she'd been so consumed by her own pain that she'd never considered how her choices were affecting me. The apology didn't undo the damage, but it did something important. It gave me permission to let go of the version of myself that had been shaped by her trauma. For the first time in my life, I could see the birthmark as something neutral, just a physical characteristic that happened to connect me to my family history rather than a flaw that needed to be hidden or overcome. I started experimenting with confidence in small ways. I'd look people in the eye during conversations instead of angling my face away. I'd let photographers capture my full face instead of insisting on profiles. I even started wearing my hair shorter, which made the birthmark more visible but also made me feel more authentic. The changes weren't dramatic or immediate, but they were real. I noticed that when I stopped treating my birthmark like something shameful, other people stopped treating it that way too. Conversations became easier, relationships became more genuine, and I started to understand what my grandfather had learned. That self-acceptance is magnetic in a way that self-consciousness never can be. College became a completely different experience. I started dating, not because I'd overcome my appearance, but because I'd stopped seeing my appearance as something to overcome. I made friends more easily because I wasn't constantly monitoring their reactions to my face. I took leadership roles and spoke up in classes because I'd stopped believing that my birthmark disqualified me from being heard. The most powerful moment came during my senior year when I was giving a presentation for a class. Halfway through, I noticed that someone in the audience was staring at my birthmark with obvious curiosity. In the past, this would have derailed me completely, would have sent me into a spiral of self-consciousness and shame. But instead, I just acknowledged it with a small nod and continued with my presentation. After class, the person who'd been staring approached me and asked about the birthmark, not rudely, but with genuine interest. Instead of deflecting or making excuses, I found myself talking openly about it, sharing some of the family history I discovered, even mentioning how I'd learned to see it as a connection to my grandfather rather than a flaw. The conversation was easy and natural, and I realized that this was what confidence actually felt like. I started thinking about all the years I'd wasted hiding from cameras, avoiding social situations, believing that my worth was diminished by my appearance. I thought about my grandfather, who'd apparently gone through the same struggle and had found his way to self-acceptance despite starting from a place of shame. I realized that in learning to love the mark he'd passed down to me, I was completing a journey he'd started. The relationship with my grandmother slowly healed, though it was never the same. She made efforts to undo some of the damage she'd done, going out of her way to compliment me, to express pride in my accomplishments, to show affection she'd withheld for years. It was awkward and sometimes felt forced, but I could see that she was trying to love me as I was rather than punishing me for who I reminded her of. She started sharing stories about my grandfather that weren't filtered through anger and betrayal. Memories of his humor, his kindness, his love for his family before everything fell apart. She even gave me more photos of him, including some where he was holding my father as a baby, where you could see both the birthmark and the tenderness in his expression. One of the last conversations we had about the whole situation was the most important. She told me that seeing me learn to embrace the birthmark had helped her understand something about forgiveness. Not forgiving my grandfather for leaving, but forgiving herself for letting that abandonment poison so many years of her life. She said that watching me find confidence despite her attempts to undermine it had shown her that healing was possible even when it seemed too late. Now, years later, I wear the birthmark like my grandfather eventually learned to, not as a badge of honor, but not as a source of shame either. It's just part of my face, part of my story, part of the genetic lottery that connects me to people I've never met and some I'll never get to meet. When people notice it, I'm comfortable talking about it. When they don't, that's fine too. I think about my grandfather often, wondering what conversations we might have had, what advice he might have given, how different my childhood might have been if I'd known I wasn't alone in carrying this mark. But I've also come to understand that maybe the journey of learning to accept it myself, of fighting through the shame and finding my own path to confidence, was something I needed to do independently. The birthmark isn't beautiful or ugly, it just is. And I've learned that the same is true for most of the things we think define us. They're only as significant as we make them, only as limiting as we allow them to be. My grandmother's hatred taught me what shame felt like, but my grandfather's example, even discovered late, taught me what acceptance could look like. I still have the letters he wrote me, still look at the photos sometimes, still wonder about the relationship we never got to have. But I'm grateful for the connection I did get to discover, even if it came through old photographs and secondhand stories rather than shared meals and actual conversations. In learning to love the face I inherited from him, I learned to love the rest of myself too. And that feels like the best possible outcome from a story that started with so much unnecessary pain.